Land of Enchantment. Harry Gold and Anatoly Yatskov sat at a small table in the back of Volk's Bar in Manhattan, talking over Gold's upcoming trip to New Mexico to meet with Klaus Fuchs. We discussed last-minute arrangements for the transfer of information once I got back from Santa Fe, Gold said. In case anything went wrong and either of them was unable to meet, Yatskov set up an emergency system. If Gold got 2 tickets to a sporting event in the mail with nothing else in the envelope, he was to take note of the date on the tickets. 3 days after the event, he was to go to a certain bar in Queens between 8 and 9 at night. He was to show up a little early, check for signs of surveillance, then take a seat. A Soviet agent would join him at the table. This was all routine to Gold by now. But then Yatskov hit him with an additional detail. He wanted me to take a little side trip, Gold remembered. He said there was a man in Albuquerque who also worked at Los Alamos and who was ready to furnish me with information. Gold didn't like it. I complained that it was jeopardizing the whole matter of the information I was getting from Fuchs, he said. It represented an additional delay, an additional period or interval in which something could happen, and I just for once got up on my hind legs and almost flatly refused to go to New Mexico. He was right to protest. A basic rule was being broken, KGB agent Alexander Feklisov later lamented, namely that 2 secret networks must remain compartmentalized without communicating between one another. The person having access to both networks becomes a weak link. If that person should stumble, both parts will fall together. Yatskov knew the rules of tradecraft, but his neck was on the line. He could not risk sending disinformation to Moscow. He wanted this second source as a backup to Fuchs's material. I have been guiding you idiots every step, he snapped at Gold. You don't realize how important this mission to Albuquerque is. Yatskov then gave Gold the name and address of the second source, $500 for the man, a password, and the torn half of a Jell-O box. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Scientists at Los Alamos celebrated, and for a happy moment thought their job was done. Their work had been driven by the absolute necessity of winning the bomb race with Germany. For me, Hitler was the personification of evil and the primary justification for the atomic bomb work, remembered the physicist Emilio Segre. Now that the bomb could not be used against the Nazis, doubts arose. Those doubts, even if they do not appear in official reports, were discussed in many private discussions. The discussions were cut short by a memo from Secretary of War Stimson, which Oppenheimer distributed in early May. The work you are doing is of tremendous importance and must go forward with all possible speed, Stimson urged. We still have the war against Japan to win. Only weeks before, the U.S. Marines had captured the Japanese island of Iwo Jima in some of the bloodiest fighting in the history of the American military. And the war would only get more ferocious as the Allies battled closer to the Japanese mainland. Pushing any doubts out of his mind, Oppenheimer worked his scientists harder than ever. The design for the uranium bomb was complete, and the plutonium bomb was nearly done. The next big question, was it necessary to test the atomic bomb to make sure it actually worked? The uranium bomb couldn't be tested. By July 1945, Los Alamos would have just enough U-235 for one bomb, and it couldn't be wasted on a test. But plutonium was a little easier to make, and the plutonium bomb design was far more complicated. Oppenheimer was convinced a test was essential. Leslie Groves disagreed. To test or not to test the plutonium bomb was a very hot issue, George Kistiakowsky remembered. Oppenheimer and I were pleading with General Groves that there had to be a test because the whole scheme was so uncertain. But General Groves said he couldn't afford to lose all that plutonium. Oppenheimer won the argument by insisting that without a test, the use of the gadget over enemy territory will have to be done substantially blindly. He selected a section of flat New Mexico desert near the Alamogordo Air Force Base. He named the site Trinity. The test was set for mid-July. As temperatures soared over 100 degrees, the scientists and soldiers moved into tents at the test site. Each morning they shook tarantulas and scorpions from their boots and tied handkerchiefs over their mouths in a hopeless effort to keep out the flying sand. They worked 20-hour days, setting up instruments to measure the blast and building a 100-foot steel tower to hold the bomb. Robert Oppenheimer's younger brother, Frank, also a physicist, helped prepare for the test at Trinity. People were feverishly setting up wires all over the desert, he said, building the tower, building little huts in which to put cameras and house people at the time of the explosion. No one told Dorothy McKibben what was going on, but she was able to figure it out. More trucks than ever were rumbling past her Santa Fe office, more scientists were checking in, and she kept getting calls from top government and military officials in Washington asking about hotel rooms in the area. The voices on the telephones showed strain and tautness, she said. I sensed we were about to reach some sort of climax. Harry Gold got to Santa Fe a little after noon on June 2nd. With a few hours to kill before his meeting with Fuchs, he strolled through a local history museum. While there, he picked up a street map entitled New Mexico, Land of Enchantment. He checked the map for the spot he was to meet Fuchs and marked it with a pen. He was glad not to have to ask for directions, making it that much less likely that anyone would remember he was ever in town. Later that afternoon, he walked to the Castillo Street Bridge, a gray arch over the narrow trickle called the Santa Fe River. Hardly more than a creek, Gold said to himself as he waited in the bright sun. He checked the watch on his sweaty wrist. It was 4:05 p.m. Fuchs should have been there 5 minutes ago. He looked around, feeling conspicuous on the empty bridge. It was, he said, no place for a stranger to be standing around doing nothing. Standard Soviet tradecraft was to wait no more than 5 minutes at a public meeting spot. Any longer could attract attention. But Gold had had to plead with his boss to get time off. He didn't know when he'd be able to make it back to New Mexico. He decided to wait a little longer. Finally, at 4:20, Fuchs's blue car pulled up. Gold ducked into the passenger seat, and Fuchs drove off. Fuchs apologized, saying he'd gotten a flat tire. Gold glanced over at the physicist. He was looking healthier. His usually pale skin had some color, and he'd put on a little weight. Fuchs stopped the car at a deserted spot. He gave Gold a quick update on the progress at Los Alamos and the upcoming test. They set their next meeting for September, the soonest Gold thought he could get away from work again. Then Fuchs handed over what Gold described as a considerable packet of information. I did what I consider to be the worst I have done, Fuchs would say several years later, namely to give information about the principle of the design of the plutonium bomb. Gold climbed onto a bus with the plans for an atomic bomb in his travel bag. His head was pounding, and he wasn't sure if it was from stress or the altitude. Santa Fe is over 7,000 feet above sea level. When he got to Albuquerque, Gold was told every hotel room in town was booked. He wandered for hours. Near midnight, in desperate need of rest, he asked a passing policeman where he could spend the night. The cop directed him to a rooming house where he was given a cot in the hall. He couldn't sleep. Every police siren, every drunken hoot, every sound that night triggered the same thought. They might be coming for me. The next morning, Gold walked to the address given to him by Anatoly Yatskov, entered the building, walked up to the second-floor apartment, and knocked. The door was opened by a young man wearing army pants and a pajama shirt. He had curly black hair and a goofy grin. "Mr. Greenglass?" Gold asked. "Yes. I come from Julius." Hearing this phrase, Greenglass turned back into the tiny apartment. He picked up his wife's purse and took out the torn half of a Jell-O box. Gold took out his half of the Jell-O box and handed it to Greenglass. Greenglass held the torn pieces together. They fit perfectly, clearly two halves of the same box. Gold stepped into the apartment and introduced himself to Greenglass and his wife as Dave from Pittsburgh. He asked for the package. Greenglass said it wasn't ready. He needed a few hours to write up his report. Gold sighed angrily. "You know," Greenglass said, still smiling, "there are several men at Los Alamos who might also be willing to furnish information. If you want me to, I can go right ahead and talk to them." "The devil you can," Gold hissed, infuriated by this source's lack of tradecraft training. "You don't approach people like that and say, 'Can you get me information on the atom bomb?'" Greenglass apologized, said he was just trying to help. Gold said he'd be back in a few hours. Exhausted and annoyed, he walked down the stairs muttering to himself, "Who in the world ever got this guy into this business? Does this poor baby know what the heck he is fooling with?" Though Gold didn't know the details, David Greenglass was an army sergeant assigned to Los Alamos. He worked in a machine shop on the hill, helping to build the super-precise explosive molds needed for the implosion bomb. Greenglass wasn't a scientist and didn't know nearly as much about the bomb as Klaus Fuchs or Ted Hall. Still, his knowledge was useful, and the Soviets wanted every scrap of information they could get. Gold returned to Greenglass's apartment later that afternoon. Greenglass gave him an envelope containing about 10 pages of notes and rough sketches, and Gold handed the soldier $500 in cash. Gold traveled by train to Chicago, caught a plane to Washington, D.C., and jumped on a train up to New York City. From there, he took the subway to Queens and found his way to a deserted area near a cemetery. Anatoly Yatskov was there. "We met for a matter of seconds," Gold recalled. "I turned over the information."